The chaotic Australian Grand Prix didn't just launch a new Formula One era, it exposed a crucial technical flaw buried deep inside the 2006 regulations. For the first time in F1 history, nearly 50% of a car's power now comes from a 350 kilowatts electric motor, powered by a 4 megajoule battery. And the consequences were immediate. Drivers were downshifting at full throttle. Top speeds were collapsing mid-straight, and overtakes were happening because batteries ran out, not because drivers were faster. Behind the scenes, the FIA already knew something was wrong. That's why an emergency review is now scheduled immediately after the Chinese Grand Prix. But the real story isn't the race itself. It's the political and technical battle now unfolding inside Formula One over whether these revolutionary rules have already failed. The 2026 regulations were designed to create the most electrically advanced Formula One cars ever built. The power unit formula shifted dramatically. A 350 kilowatts MGU-K electric motor paired with a reduced internal combustion engine, creating a near 50-50th split between electric and combustion power. On paper, this looked revolutionary. The chassis rules also produced smaller, lighter cars, and despite reduced downforce, lap times in Melbourne were only a few seconds slower than 2025. An impressive technical achievement for the first race of a new regulation cycle. But what Melbourne exposed wasn't the pace of the cars. It was the strange and sometimes bizarre way drivers had to extract that performance. But there's a catch. What the teams aren't openly admitting is that the entire racing dynamic is now being dictated by energy harvesting cycles, not pure driver skill. In qualifying, drivers discovered that lifting earlier into corners actually made them faster because it allowed the battery to recharge for the next straight. Even worse, the controversial phenomenon known as superclipping meant the battery sometimes started stealing energy from the engine while the driver was still flat on the throttle. The result? Speeds dropping mid-straight, cars swapping positions repeatedly, and drivers calling the racing artificial. So the real question now is this: did Formula One accidentally create a championship decided by battery management instead of racing? Before we move on, make sure to smash that like button and hit subscribe so you never miss out on any of our latest videos. Because what we're about to uncover about the FIA's emergency rule review could completely reshape the entire 2026 F1 season. To understand why the FIA is suddenly considering rule changes after just 2 races, we need to start with the physics of the 2026 power unit. Because this is where the real problem begins. The new system relies on a 4 megajoule battery feeding a 350 kilowatts MGU-K, which equates to roughly 469 horsepower of electric output. That's an enormous number. In fact, it means the electric system alone now produces almost as much power as the entire hybrid system did in the early V6 turbo era. But there's a catch. If you want to deploy that much energy, you have to harvest it somewhere. And this is where the system starts behaving in ways that nobody expected. Traditionally, energy harvesting in Formula One happens under braking. The MGU-K converts kinetic energy from the rear wheels into electrical energy stored in the battery. But the 2026 rules demand far more energy per lap than braking zones alone can realistically generate. So the system introduced something called superclipping. Here's how it works technically. When the battery state of charge drops below a certain threshold, the engine control unit automatically switches the MGU-K into a harvesting mode. Even if the driver is still accelerating, instead of sending full power to the rear wheels, the system diverts part of that power back into the battery. And that's why drivers experienced something completely bizarre in Melbourne. Imagine exiting a corner at full throttle, expecting maximum acceleration, and suddenly the engine revs drop, the top speed collapses, and the car behind you blasts past. That's exactly what happened multiple times in the battle between George Russell and Charles Leclerc. Look at the telemetry from those opening laps. Russell would activate the boost mode to overtake Leclerc down the straight, but the moment he did that, his battery charge would fall below the optimal threshold. 1 lap later, the system would begin harvesting again, and Leclerc would simply power past. Russell himself described it as a yo-yo effect, and if you watch the onboard footage carefully, you can actually see the moment it happens. The engine note suddenly dips slightly, even though the driver is still flat out. That's the MGU-K switching into harvesting mode mid-straight. Now here's where the political tension inside Formula One starts to build, because some teams, especially those closely aligned with Mercedes-Benz power unit technology, appear to have adapted to this system much faster than others. Mercedes looked remarkably comfortable managing the energy cycles in Melbourne. Their deployment patterns allowed Russell to stay competitive even when the battery levels fluctuated. Meanwhile, several rival teams struggled badly with the new logic controlling energy deployment. For example, Oscar Piastri experienced unexplained power delivery inconsistencies. something that insiders say may have been caused by the self-learning energy management algorithms still adapting to real race conditions. During the formation lap, both Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc reportedly faced critical battery charge issues, forcing engineers to improvise last-second energy strategies. And that's when the driver started speaking out. Max Verstappen didn't hold back. He openly admitted that he wasn't enjoying the new cars, arguing that Formula One should be about pushing the limits of grip, not managing battery percentages. Meanwhile, Lando Norris went even further, warning that the new system could create dangerous speed differentials of up to 50 kilometers per hour on the straights. Think about that number for a moment. A 50 km/h speed difference between two cars approaching the same braking zone is not just dramatic, it's potentially catastrophic. In Melbourne, we already saw one near miss when Liam Lawson nearly collided with Franco Colapinto, a moment that highlighted exactly how unpredictable these energy cycles can become. But the biggest shock of all was what happened in qualifying. Take turn 9 at Albert Park Circuit, a legendary high-speed corner, normally taken at the absolute limit of downforce. Under the 2006 rules, drivers discovered something counterintuitive. They were actually faster not attacking the corner fully. By slightly lifting off the throttle earlier, the MGU-K could harvest extra energy. That additional charge could then be deployed later on the straight for a net lap time gain. In other words, the fastest lap was no longer the one where the driver pushed hardest through the corner. It was the one where the driver managed the battery most efficiently. And this is exactly why McLaren team principal Andrea Stella raised serious concerns after the race. He warned that Formula One risks losing one of its defining characteristics: drivers pushing their cars to the absolute limit of grip. Instead, the sport could become a kind of high-speed energy strategy game. Some engineers have even compared the new racing style to chess played at 300 km/h, because now overtaking isn't just about braking later or carrying more speed through corners. You have to calculate three things simultaneously: your battery state of charge, your rival's deployment strategy, and the exact moment when their system will switch into harvesting mode. And this is precisely what created the 120 overtakes recorded during the Australian Grand Prix, a huge increase compared to the previous season. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Many of those overtakes didn't happen because drivers were faster. They happened because one car had energy and the other didn't. That's why several drivers described the racing as artificial. Even Charles Leclerc admitted the battles were more about strategy than bravery. Now the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile is facing an incredibly difficult decision, because the power units themselves are already homologated, meaning their core design cannot be changed. So the only possible fixes involve adjusting how the energy is harvested and deployed. And according to insiders, the FIA already has three potential solutions ready. The first option is increasing the superclipping harvesting rate from 250 kilowatts to 350 kilowatts.